Hey, what's up everybody? It's Timothy here. This is the last portion of the full spoiler that I'm going to be looking at. After today, I'll have looked at every single card in the set. Hopefully, I didn't miss anything. And my next step after that is to go over each individual color and start giving them ratings. Start giving the cards a score out of 10. And by that, I mean like how likely am I to pick them out of a draft. Of course, I'll mention them in sealed if they're more relevant in sealed and stuff like that. But I'd like to come up with kind of a rough pick list for my early drafts. And that's to help me out. That's potentially to help you guys out if you kind of agree with my reasoning on some of these cards. And I'm going to miss the ball on some of these cards. You can never really tell how good or bad a card's going to be until the set comes out and you've actually played with it. So pre-release will be a good time for me to start adjusting those numbers, but I'm hoping to get those reviews out before pre-release. But anyway, we're going to look at the blue and white cards today. Thanks for joining me, and if you like or dislike anything that I say during this video, feel free to comment below and let me know what you think of some of the cards. But we're going to kick it off pretty high here with Windkin Raiders. 4 and double blue for an uncommon human artificer, a 4/3 flyer with improvise. And remember that improvise means you can tap artifacts to make this thing cheaper by 1 colorless mana for each artifact you tap when you cast it. So potentially this can get down to double blue 4/3 flyer, right? Obviously that's unrealistic for around like turn 3, maybe turn 4 that's possible. Or you could turn 3 this thing. I have no idea. You could potentially go turn 1 artifact, turn 2 something like a puzzle knot that makes an additional artifact, and then power this out on turn 3. But that's just the nut draw, right? That's not going to happen very often. I think turn 4 or 5 is pretty reasonable for this thing to come down, in which case it is huge. It is by no means a bomb or anything like that. A 4/3 flyer is still pretty easy to deal with removal spells, but it is going to dominate the board as far as creatures go. Most creatures that come out around the same time are going to be like 2/3 flyers and stuff like that, or 3/3 ground creatures. So if you can power this out a couple turns earlier than turn 6, it's pretty great. And it's fine on turn 6. A 4/3 flyer for 6 mana is not impressive, but I think it is pretty likely. I think somewhere upwards 75+% of the time you'll be able to get this down for 5 mana or less. Granted, you may not be able to do it as early as turn 3, but that is a possibility. And yeah, the card's fine. One thing I want to mention here is that there are a good number of 3 toughness and 3 power flyers in this format, to the point where I think these cards lose just a little bit of value because they're going to trade off for other flyers quite often. But I think most of those are centered in blue and white, so a lot of times if you're playing against like a red-black opponent, you can just dominate the skies with cards like this. And flying is usually a good way to win games if you have no other meaningful game plan. So Windkin Raiders gets a pretty big thumbs up from me. Moving on, we have Negate. And Negate is pretty standard material by now, no pun intended. It is a good limited sideboard card, no doubt, especially when people are going to be drafting things like Baral and stuff. They're going to be incentivized to play these spell-based decks. But I still like to keep Negate in the sideboard. I think it's comparable to something like Plummet, where if you mainboard it, you're very likely going to have a couple targets for it. But the possibility that your opponent's just not running that many spells or non-creature spells makes this a little bit worse. And of course, Negate is just fantastic when it comes in from the sideboard after you've seen that your opponent has like some pretty hefty enchantments, or I don't know, maybe a Planeswalker or something like that. One thing to mention about Negate, and this gets mentioned every time Negate comes up, it is much better in sealed as a main deck card because people tend to have more powerful spells, more powerful removal in sealed. So I would not be afraid to main deck at least 1 Negate in sealed. And Two-Headed Giant Negate is a definite main deck card because there is no sideboarding in Two-Headed Giant, and your opponents will most definitely have some sort of spells for you to hit here. So as far as draft purposes go, if I'm playing blue, I'd love to have at least 1 Negate in my sideboard. If it gets down to the end of the pack and, you know, there's just nothing else to pick from, I'd be happy to pick up a Negate and just have it available to me. Salvage Scuttler, another crab for my crab EDH deck. I'm really waiting on a crab lord. If this could get out to Wizards and you guys could just make a crab lord for me, please, like, that would just make my day. But anyway, Salvage Scuttler is 4 and a blue for a 4/4 uncommon crab creature whenever Scuttler attacks, return an artifact you control to its owner's hand. Now, this is a pretty medium to like low priority card, except when you can combo with it. So if you have like Prophetic Prisms in your deck or something like that, or artifacts with good enter the battlefield triggers, that's when you want to play this card because it lets you really combo. I've seen some people completely knock this card and treat it like a downside, and it is a downside, but it's the type of downside that you can turn into an upside in the right kind of deck. There was a card like this in, I want to say, Born of the Gods, somewhere in Theros block. It was almost exactly the same, like 5 mana, 4/4 Sea Serpent creature, but you had to bounce an enchantment in order for it to attack. And this is very similar. Obviously, in Theros, that could let you do some crazy things with Constellation, and I think we could say the same here. This is uncommon for a reason, right? Because it has combo potential with some pretty ridiculous stuff. Now, that being said, if you're not comboing with this, you don't even play this card. 5 mana, 4/4 that has to give you some sort of board disadvantage in order to attack is not very good. Do notice that it's whenever it attacks, not in order for it to attack. So if you don't have an artifact on board, this gets to just attack anyway, and it can still block. But the card is not amazing, but it goes very, very high up in value when you're playing some sort of artifact deck with artifacts that you can spare to bounce back to your hands. And I just wanted to see if that card's down here, but it's not. It's not. It was I want to say Floodtide Serpent or Hightide Serpent or something like that. I have no idea. Shielded Aether Thief is 1 in a blue for a 0/4 uncommon Vidalcan rogue. He's doing the Vidalcan arm thing. If you go look at the Vidalcans in this set, they're all doing this weird arm thing where they have to have their arms stretched out in some, I don't know. I have no idea what's going on with them. But this has flash. I missed that this had flash the first time. I don't know how. It's the first thing written on the card. But it does have flash, and that like puts it way, way up, higher than I was going to put it up. And I was already going to put it pretty high. Whenever it blocks, you get an energy, and you may tap it and pay 3 energy to draw a card. Now, everything about this card combines very, very well into a really, really solid blocker. If you're playing some control deck, you really want a card like this. I have no idea why people play Consulate Skygate. I hate the card. I think it's terrible. Even as a sideboard option, it's not fantastic. Playable, but not fantastic, right? This guy is everything you want Consulate Skygate to be. It blocks. Obviously, it doesn't have reach, but it's a flash blocker too, so you know your opponent's not going to really see it coming. You get an energy for blocking with it, and very likely you'll maybe net 1 energy off this card per game because your opponent's just going to stop attacking into it, and then that's a very good energy sink. Drawing a card for 3 energy is fantastic, so if you're in some blue-based deck, you can just play tons of... There are a couple sea creature type commons and uncommons that give you a bunch of energy. If you think of like High Tide Hermit or the Moray, the little eel thing from this set that gives you 4 energy when it comes down, you can turn that into cards with this guy, and it makes those cards go a little bit higher up in value when you have something that draws you cards off your energy. So I would expect most of the time for you to be able to get at least an energy off this card as a surprise blocker. It doesn't have any power, so it's not like you're destroying your opponent in combat, but it's a nice little trick that turns into an actual board presence and an actual engine in the right sort of deck. So yeah, I like this card quite a bit. I would be willing to pick this very, very highly. I don't know that this is a first pick. Like, I'm never going to open a pack and be like, well, Shielded Aether Thief is the first pick of my draft, unless my pack is terrible. But if I know I'm going in blue, maybe my first 2 picks were blue, I would love to have a couple of these in my deck. Taken to Custody. I'm going to err on the side of saying this card is bad. It's 1 blue for a common instant. Tap target creature, doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Now, normally, you don't usually get these sort of effects. I don't know. Normally, you see this sort of effect in multiples, like it's tap 2 creatures, they don't untap or something like that. Or maybe they cantrip or something like that. This is just a cheap 1 mana save me from a creature attacking. And there's not a lot you can do with that. It's not a very good play early in the game. It's not even really a particularly good game we'll play later in the game. It's similar to Pressure Point in that if you're an aggressive deck and you want to be attacking or something like that, then you could play it, but at least Pressure Point like draws a card. This one doesn't. If this drew a card or did something just a tiny little bit more, it would be fantastic. But as is, I think this card is very, very weak. You could put this in your deck if you're really trying to stall out to the late game, or if you're somehow a really like early game blue aggressive deck, which I don't see happening in this format. Otherwise, this card is very unimpressive, and I would err on the side of saying this is probably like last pick material in this set. I don't see a lot of uses for it. There aren't a lot of uses for having something tapped either, so I'm not really seeing the appeal of a card like that. Hinterland Drake is 2 and a blue for a 2/3 common Drake creature, has flying and can't block artifact creatures. Now, it can't block artifact creatures is actually like a reasonable downside. This is obviously Scrapskin Drake, but modified for Kaladesh purposes. Scrapskin Drake being a creature that can only block flyers. And that seems like an actual downside for a flyer like this. Now, the format is aggressive enough that sometimes you need to block with your 3-drops, especially if you are on the draw. If your opponent's playing a very aggressive deck, you can't afford to play like 2 power flyers. That's really where the downfall of Windrake was in this set. Windrake is a perfectly reasonable card. 3 mana 2/2 flyer is usually pretty good in most sets. But in Kaladesh, Windrake was just not very good because you would lose a race to very aggressive decks if Windrake was your answer to it, and Windrake didn't block those creatures especially well either. I see that being the case here too. This is going to block a lot of things if you need it to. It is going to dominate the air early in the game, which is pretty nice. Most flyers around 3 mana are going to be 2/2s or 2/1s or something along those lines. So Hinterland Drake should get a decent amount of damage in there, which to me makes it, a fine card, like a middle pick blue card if I know that I want to be kind of stalling the game out and trying to win in the air or something like that. But I'm not impressed with the card, and I do think that is an actual downside in this set. Not a huge one, granted, but a downside that will come up from time to time and will make you quite sad when you can't block with your Hinterland Drake. But as is, this is a fine card, slightly above filler material, in my opinion, but not too much far above it. It's not really that much more powerful than Windrake. Ice Over. Ice Over is 1 and a blue for a common aura enchantment. Enchant artifact or creature. Enchanted permanent doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. Now, we've got like a Malfunction type card here. Keep in mind, Malfunction actually tapped the permanent down when you targeted it. Ice Over requires that permanent to already be tapped in order for it to be super relevant. However, Malfunction costs twice as much as Ice Over. Ice Over is a pretty cheap answer to a lot of things, and cards like this usually do their job pretty well by making sure that something that's really threatening from your opponent just isn't going to be able to attack anymore. There are a couple effects in this set that untap things, but not a lot that are main deckable, so you don't have to worry about people getting one over on you by untapping their iced over creature or something like that. This can tap down artifacts too if there's something just completely absurd on board that you need to tap down. That's not a creature, but most of the time this is going to be pseudo creature removal. Now, keep in mind, I said this in Kaladesh, and I'll say it again. Cards like this do lose value in this sort of set for a couple reasons. First off, there are blink effects like Aviary Mechanic. There are a couple blink effects in this limited format that can just take a creature and put it back on the battlefield or put it back in their owner's hands, which make auras a very inconsistent way of removing creatures from the field. In a lot of sets, they're almost permanent removal. In this set, they work about half the time. So if you're playing against a blue or white deck, your Ice Overs and your cards like that go way down in value because your opponent's going to be able to return their own creature and knock the aura off. Second off, most artifact-based removal also hits enchantments, and that's true for Kaladesh. That's true for almost everything in this set except maybe 1 or 2 cards, especially in green and white. If a card destroys an artifact, it almost always destroys an enchantment too, and a lot of times people are going to be main decking or sideboarding in artifact removal, and incidentally they'll have enchantment removal as well. So keep that in mind when you're relying on cards like Ice Over here to lock down creatures, that your opponent is very likely going to have an answer for it, so you can't have this as your only removal in the deck. You do need some actual hard removal or some bounce spells or something like that. If you rely on this, you will be punished for it some percentage of the time, but most of the time Ice Over is a solid effect that you'll play at least a couple of them in your main deck and not worry about it too often. Here's a card that this context matters a lot, and I'm not sure how powerful this card's going to be or how useful. So I'm starting off by giving it kind of a low rating, and then I think it's going to go up over time. I really do. So the card is Illusionist Stratagem. 3 and a blue for an uncommon instant. Exile up to 2 target creatures you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's controls, then you draw a card. Now, the very first thing to think of here is there was a card in Eldritch Moon, I believe. It might have been Shadows, but I think it was Eldritch Moon. It was called Displace. It was 2 and a blue to do the same exact effect here at instant speed, but it didn't draw you a card. It's right here. 2 and a blue, exile 2 creatures, put them back on the battlefield, right? But it didn't draw you a card. Now, that card had some potential in Eldritch Moon. There were some neat enter the battlefield effects. And sometimes it could save your creature. But most of the time, this was almost unplayable. It was very, very bad card for some reason. Sometimes it played very well in your deck, but even when you had the deck that wanted Displace, it wasn't a card that you played very often. And that leads me to believe that maybe Illusionist Stratagem is not that great either. Now, the difference here is 1 extra mana and you draw a card. Drawing a card is pretty huge because if it's not doing anything really busted, at least it can replace itself. But a 4 mana cantrip is not as good as a 1 or 2 mana cantrip. Now, with that being said, there are a lot of really sweet enter the battlefield triggers in blue and white. If you look at cards like Cloud Blazer or the blue-white uncommon from Aether Revolt, I forget its name, something Patrol, those have really strong enter the battlefield triggers, and that makes Illusionist Stratagem go up a little bit in value. Now, obviously, if you have no enter the battlefield triggers, I don't think you play this card because it's just acrobatic maneuver for 2 creatures. But acrobatic maneuver was actually really good in Kaladesh, so maybe Illusionist Stratagem as a double acrobatic maneuver that replaces itself still might be up in value. But I need to see it in action. I really do. Obviously, this can save your creatures from a removal spell too, which is pretty decent, but doesn't save them from board wipes. Keep that in mind. So I have no idea what to think of this card yet until I see it. The thing that has me down on it is the 4 mana cost. If it turns out that that's reasonable, then this will be a good card. But if it turns out that that's just a tad bit too expensive for this sort of effect, then the card is not going to really shine. I will wait to see it in action. It's the type of card I like, so I'll try it out a couple times, but we'll see where it ends up landing. Leave in the Dust. If I had asked you, and we didn't look at this card, if I had asked you what color you think a card named Leave in the Dust would be, I probably would have said red, not blue, but Leave in the Dust is a blue card, 3 and a blue exactly, for a common instant. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Draw a card. Now, this isn't just creature removal. It can hit other permanents, potentially enchantments or artifacts. And keep in mind, there are a couple enchantments in this set that gain counters or they care about rally or something like that. This is a pretty decent way to interrupt what those cards are doing. But most of the time, this is going to be instant speed creature removal. It's essentially Repulse for 1 more mana. Or if you look at, again, Eldritch Moon, the card Drag Under, which was a very, very high pick blue common, did the same exact thing, but it was a sorcery and cost 1 less mana. I think tacking on the extra mana here makes this card still worth it at instant speed, even though it starts to get clunky. You don't really want multiples of this sort of effect. 4 mana removal that isn't hard permanent removal is a little bit clunky in multiples and isn't going to save you if you're that far behind. This does a good job if you're at parity or if you're ahead or if you just need to break through some sort of board stall. This is a good card because it's going to draw you another card and it's going to shake up what your opponent's doing. But as is, I think you don't really want more than 1 of these, and you definitely don't want 2 of these. Or more than 2 of these. I could see myself playing 2 of them in kind of a controlling, maybe mid-rangey blue deck, but I don't know how often that sort of deck exists. So I'm a little skeptical of how good this card is, but comparing it to cards like it in the past, it has a lot of potential to be good. Finishing up with the blue cards, we got 2 more here. Here's another one that's just hard to evaluate. Lots of bounce effects. Dispersal Technician. See, he's got the Vidalcan arm thing going on. But anyway, 4 and a blue for a 3/2 common Vidalcan Artificer. When Dispersal Technician enters the battlefield, you may return another artifact to its owner's hand. Now, the stats here are not good. 3-2 for 5 is just not going to cut it in this format. This trades for bears, and there are a lot of bears, and you don't want your 5-drop to trade for a 2-drop. That's why vanilla 6-2s and 5-2s just aren't good creatures, because they trade so low, they're so mana inefficient, that they're just usually not worth it. Now, if you can get that enter the battlefield trigger to pop off, that's decent. If this is just returning an artifact like a servo or like a prism or a puzzle nut or something, then, you know, it's okay. It's not great. But what you really want to be doing is returning a creature that also costs around 4 to 5 mana. So you want this to act as a mana war for a really good creature on your opponent's side. So if they're playing, I don't know, something like a Bastion Mastodon, like some 5 mana big buck creature, then this could be fine because it's essentially going to time walk your opponent and make them waste their turn recasting that expensive creature. If this could return an artifact or creature, I'd be a little happier with it because then it would be a traditional mana war. But the fact that it's limited to artifacts means that sometimes you're going to play this or you're going to have it in your hand and you're going to hope that it does its best on turn 5 and it's just going to be a vanilla 3-2. So there is not really a there's... At its best, this is a mana war, and not one with particularly good stats. And at its worst, it's just not a very good card. So I'm willing to think this is kind of in the filler range, but I have no idea, really. I don't think it's going to play out very well. And just to clarify for anyone who may not know, when I say a mana war, I mean a creature that comes down and bounces another creature back to their opponent's hand, in the tradition of mana war, right? 6 fingers. Apparently all the Vidalcans have 6 fingers on Kaladesh, and I just noticed like a week ago. He does too. And then check out the hand thing. He's got like the double hand thing going on. Bastion Inventor is 5 and a blue for a 4/4 common Vidalcan Artificer with Improvise and Hexproof. Hexproof being an extremely strong limited ability. Whenever something has Hexproof, I have to really kind of analyze it because Hexproof creatures are hard to interact with. Most of your opponent's removal spells are not going to be able to deal with it. So if you can buff the creature up or give it evasion or something, that creature can often win the game. Now, Improvise makes this creature even better. At 6 mana, a 4/4 Hexproof is kind of shruggable. At 5 mana, a 4/4 Hexproof, I might have said 6/6, but a 4/4 Hexproof at 5 mana is pretty passable card, and a 4 mana 4/4 Hexproof is very strong, with anything lower than that being kind of an absolutely absurd card. Now, blue doesn't have a lot of ways to really beef this up, but if you're playing maybe blue-green or blue-white or something like that, something that can reliably give this counters or maybe even enchant it with a decent enchantment, then this card goes way up in value. And blue does encourage you to play artifacts, so you might have some equipment laying around or something like that. This works particularly well with Inventor's Goggles, where Inventor's Goggles can help pay for the Bastion Inventor and then also equip to it for free, making this a 5/6 hexproof for somewhere around 5 or less mana, which is just absolutely absurd for a common. So this could be a game ender in the right kind of deck, but I think you do need to give it some sort of evasion, or you do need to have some sort of plan to make it a big creature. On its own, a 4/4 is just going to be on parity with what the other colors are doing, especially green with its absurdly strong commons and uncommons. So if you can get this card to really kick up the gears somehow and be a dominant force, your opponent's not going to be able to remove it very easily, and you're just going to win the game. There is an enchantment we'll see here that gives fly into a creature, so maybe that's what we're looking at. But that's also an expensive card. I do like this. It's not as good as Seeker Serpent, despite being just 1 mana cheaper or 1 blue mana cheaper, but it does have a lot of potential to just be a game ender for blue, which is what blue needs out of its commons sometimes. You do need a card like this in your deck, occasionally. Moving on, we have white as our last color to look at, and white's got some pretty cool ones here. We're going to start with Thopter Arrest, which is 2 and a white for an uncommon enchantment. When Thopter Arrest enters the battlefield, exile target artifact or creature an opponent controls until Thopter Arrest leaves the battlefield. Now, the first time I read this, I missed that creature part. I thought it only exiled an artifact, and I was like, it's playable. But no, this hits creatures too, which makes it almost automatically like a first pickable card, right? I would first pick this. It's better than Fairgrounds Warden, in my opinion. From Kaladesh, Fairgrounds Warden exiled a creature when it came into play, but it was a fragile creature. It was a 1/3, and people are like, oh, Fairgrounds Warden is busted. And it's like, no, I mean, it's a good card. It's definitely a good card, but it dies so easy, and then you just get your card back, right? It didn't do anything. So you need to be winning with that sort of card. Thopter Arrest has all the upside of Fairgrounds Warden while also being harder to kill. Enchantments are just generally harder to kill. I already mentioned this with Ice Over, that your opponent may just have incidental enchantment removal in their deck because of it being tied to artifact removal so closely, but that's mostly in green and white, and blue has a couple ways to bounce permanents, but there aren't a lot of ways to deal with enchantments in the set outside of those corner cases, and this will do a pretty good job of removing a creature from the battlefield, and like I said with a couple other cards, occasionally targeting some really pesky artifact that your opponents have. Maybe they have some combo piece like a Dynavolt Tower that's actively like destroying your face or something, and you can exile it with this. I like the card. And I do think it's a first pickable material. O-Ring type effects, Oblivion Ring type effects like that are usually pretty good. Restoration Specialist is 1 and a white for a 2/1 uncommon Dwarf Artificer. For 1 white mana, you can sacrifice it and return up to 1 target artifact and up to 1 target enchantment from your graveyard to your hand. Now, this is a really good effect. Even if this only said artifact, that would be a solid card because this is already a bear. It's going to have the potential to just trade off if you need it to, have the potential to deal a couple early game damage, trade off for other 2/2s and stuff like that, or 3/2s even. And then it has this late game ability or this mid to late game ability where you're able to get a couple cards back from your graveyard, artifacts and enchantments, potentially one of each. There aren't a lot of enchantments that are going to end up in your graveyard. If you look at the Thopter Arrest above, that's often just going to sit on the battlefield for the remainder of the game. But if your opponent removes it or it gets sent to the graveyard somehow, maybe milling, something along those lines, or discarded, then you have the potential to get that back alongside an artifact. Most of the time, this will read 1 mana, get an artifact back from your graveyard by sacking it, but every now and then, you'll be able to get an enchantment back too. And there are a couple good auras in this set that I could see people playing, and then you bouncing those back to your hands with this. So this does a lot for a 2-drop, and that's why it's an uncommon. Potentially being a 2-for-1 in the late game, and in the early game, just being what you want on curve, a 2 mana, 2/1. Be careful of that 1 toughness, it's a little fragile, but 2 mana, 2 power creature is usually pretty good, and when it has upside that can also be a 2-for-1, that strikes me as a card that I want to pay attention to. Alright, next up on our list is Eye Harpooner, 2 and a white for a 2/2 uncommon Dwarf Warrior with Revolt. When Eye Harpooner enters the battlefield, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, destroy target tapped creature an opponent controls. So the floor here is a 3 mana 2/2, which is not a good card. So you really need that Revolt trigger to work. Your opponent's going to have a tapped creature, and you're also going to have to somehow get a permanent off your side of the battlefield, while also having 3 mana up to play this card. So you got to jump through a few hoops to get this to work, but when it works very well. Just straight up destroying a creature on your 3-drop is great. Notice that this plays very, very, very well with blink effects. So if you have like Acrobatic Maneuver in your deck, you can just play this out on turn 3, and then on turn 4 when your opponent attacks you and they tap their creature down, you could actually Acrobatic Maneuver this, have it come back in, it counts itself as leaving the battlefield, and then destroy an attacking creature while also drawing off Acrobatic Maneuver. So there's some pretty busted stuff. This is the type of card where I look at that Stratagem blue card and I think, wow, there's a lot of potential there. But yeah, if you can't get the Revolt to work on this pretty reliably, it's not a good card. And, this is the type of card that it is powerful enough that it encourages you to play maybe some pretty bad enablers like the White Implement or something like that in order to get it to work. But I wouldn't jump through too many hoops. If you look at your 23, 24 playables and you see that you're just not going to be able to put this into play and trigger Revolt reliably, then it is a cuttable card. But the upside is strong enough, actually very, very good, that I'd be willing to play maybe a couple of the low-end enablers in order to get a card like this to work. If I had other Revolt cards, I'm not going to put those in just for this guy. But if I knew that I really wanted Revolt to work, I could see cards like this justifying playing a couple weaker cards, because this is above average. It's very, very strong when it works, but it's very weak when it doesn't. So risk-reward type card. Deft Dismissal is 3 and a white for an uncommon instant. Deft Dismissal deals 3 damage divided as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 target attacking or blocking creatures. Now, this has a very very high upside of being able to destroy like 3 tokens or something like that. Killing a bunch of Thopters or a bunch of Servos or maybe a couple X1s or something like that. But I look at this card and I see 4 mana and I wonder why it's so expensive. This feels like it could have been a 3 mana card and a common and have been completely fine. 3 damage is not a lot for 4 mana, even splitting that up. Obviously, you can engineer some situations where this is a 2-for-1, but I don't see that happening so often that this card is just fantastic. If this is 4 mana, destroy target creature with 3 power or 3 toughness or something like that, target attacking or blocking creature with 3 toughness, then it's just impeccable timing. And impeccable timing is like an average combat trick. I don't know. I don't like this card. I don't think it's very good. It's the type of card that I could see cutting from my deck and then boarding it in when I know my opponent has a bunch of X1s. But what happens if your opponent plays a 4/4? Your 4 mana instant speed removal trick doesn't kill a 4 toughness creature. It's kind of disappointing, right? This could have been 4 damage or just notched up a little bit, or maybe made a common or something like that in order for it to be a little bit better. But I'm not seeing this as a powerful combat trick, in my opinion. Maybe I'm missing something, but I don't think it's very good. Alright, so this card maybe, let's talk about this card. So, first off, the card is Fischl Guardian, 3 and a white for a 1/4 uncommon cat beast. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile another target permanent you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Now, this is a pretty good effect. The stats aren't great. A 4 mana 1/4 is not great, so you want to make sure that ability's actually doing something. It can only target your stuff, so you can't like kill a token like these effects normally can or anything like that, or reset an opponent's creature with 1/1 counters or anything along those lines. But what this does is let you kind of reuse an enter the battlefield trigger. It lets you target a revolt creature, which is pretty nice, and then have that creature come back in with its revolt clause fulfilled, which is also sweet. And then also if you're just playing like busted enter the battlefield triggers, it does that too. They also combo with each other, which if you have anything on board that cares about creatures entering the battlefield, then it works nicely. Ninth Bridge Patrol, go infinite, right? Now, obviously the thing we want to talk about here is standard, right? Because this card does an infinite combo with Saheeli Rai. I didn't come up with that. You probably already know about it, but in case you're not aware, Saheeli Rai's -2 ability lets you make a copy of a creature, and it's an artifact and gains haste, blah blah blah, and it's exiled at the end of the turn. Or I don't know if it's exiled. I don't know exactly how Saheeli reads. Oh yeah, it gains haste. Now, yeah, okay. Let me rephrase that. Saheeli Rai's -2 ability makes a copy of a creature. It's an artifact. It gains haste, but it's exiled at the end of the turn or end of combat or something along those lines. So you use Saheeli Rai. You make a Fischl Guardian. That Fischl Guardian blinks Saheeli Rai automatically. It doesn't wait until end of turn, and then you just keep doing the same thing over and over again. You have infinite hasty 1/4 creatures. Which sounds awesome, but also just completely broken and degenerate for standard purposes, right? That's a turn 4 win. People keep calling it Splinter Twin, and you get the point, right? It makes infinite creatures. But the funny thing is, I'm recording this on. It is a Monday. I'm recording this on Monday, and I just read a little while ago that Wizards is making a ban and restricted announcement in a couple hours, like in an hour or two. And that's about a week before they normally make it. So a lot of people are speculating that part of this combo is going to be banned in Standard, which would be hilarious if they ban like this random uncommon card. from standard or something like that. So we'll see. It's potential, but if that doesn't happen, I'm totally playing that. This is the most degenerate standard combo. Just a turn 4 win in standard is not even okay. I have a feeling part of it will be banned, and I think it'll be Thopter Guardian, not Saheeli Rai, but it's really funny that that's super broken. Keep in mind, you can do that in draft if you open Saheeli in your last pack, and I'm going to be looking to do that every single time, hopefully in sealed or something. So pretty crazy stuff. As is, the card is good and limited, not super crazy good, but I would be happy to start my draft off with this. Well, I don't know, I wouldn't be like thrilled about it, but if I had a pretty weak pack, I could take this and see just drafting kind of like some combo deck. But anyway, enough about the Cat Beast. We've said enough. We don't even need to click this one. Gyropur Osprey is 2 and a white for a 2/2 flying common bird creature. 2/2s for 3 in the air are decent. Like we said with Windrake, they are not going to be good matchups for the super aggressive decks when your opponent goes turn 2 Voltaic Brawler, turn 2 Renegade Freighter, and you play this on turn 3 as your first play. You're just dead. You're going to lose that game. And that's an unfortunate thing about Kaladesh, is that the aggro decks are super aggro, and if you're not prepared for them, you're not going to be able to eke out a win here. With that being said, if you're playing more of a controlling deck and you have the ground blockers, you're playing your stupid Consulate Skygates or whatever, then this card gets in for a decent amount of damage until it gets bricked by, 4/3 flyer or something along those lines. And these cards are usually okay and limited. White can probably take advantage of this a little better than blue can. Just because white tends to want to attack more than blue does. But the card is pretty average, and in this set, I think it's a little bit weaker than it would be in most sets. I'm thinking of like Dawn Griff and Shadow Glider from the last couple sets, where the same exact card, but they tend to play out a little better than I think this one will. And more vanilla creatures, we have just Bastion Enforcer is 2 and a white for a 3/2 common dwarf soldier. Just a vanilla 3-mana 3/2. I've already mentioned there are a good number of 3-mana 3/2s, and they trade pretty poorly with all the 2-power 2-mana creatures in the format. So I think this is like a 5.0 out of 10 every single time. There aren't a lot of decks where you'd want this. I think 3/1s for 2 are generally just better cards than 3/2s for 3. Since they're aggressive creatures that want you to be attacking. But anyway, definitely the most flavorful card in the entire set is Caught in the Brights. Only on Kaladesh could this card exist. It's corny, it's cheesy, but it's also funny, right? It's pretty cool. 2 and a white for a common aura enchantment. The enchanted creature can't attack or block. It's worth noting this can only enchant creatures, not artifacts. The enchanted creature can't attack or block, and whenever a vehicle you control attacks, you exile the enchanted creature. So you're just running it over with a vehicle, which is awesome. And this is a very playable card too. It's a pacifism, and a lot of limited formats have been pushing towards 3-mana pacifisms instead of 2-mana pacifisms, with Choke and Restraints down here being a very similar card, and that's good. If it didn't even have the Exile Clause, that would be a fine playable card, but the Exile Clause even makes it better because it means your opponent's not going to be able to bounce that aura off. I mentioned this with Ice Over, that you can't really rely on these sorts of effects to be your only removal in the deck. That's why I think Revoke Privileges lost a tiny bit of value, while still being a very strong common, lost a tiny bit of value in Kaladesh because there were blink effects and return to hand effects that could get around these auras. The added bonus of Caught in the Brights is that whole vehicle clause lets you exile that creature if you have that vehicle attacking, meaning your opponent only has a little bit of time to kind of get around your aura before they die. And white does want you to draft vehicles a little higher than most other colors do. Not to mention that this works nicely with anything that can get enchantments back from the graveyard, since when you exile the creature, Caught in the Brights will go to the graveyard, and we already saw that little uncommon specialist guy who can grab enchantments from the graveyard. So I like this quite a bit. It works with a good number of other cards in the set, let alone just the vehicles, but like SRAM really wants you to play this card. SRAM really wants you to play that card, but it's quite nice. Conviction is 1 and a white for a common aura, enchanted creature. The enchanted creature gets +1/+3, and you may pay a white mana to return Conviction to its owner's hand. I think the gimmick here is that this enables Revolt pretty easily. This is what I'm talking about, a low-end, low-impact card that triggers Revolt, similar to the white Implement. If you're really trying to get your Revolt cards to work, then I could see main deck in this. But if you have no Revolt cards, or your Revolt cards are just not that hard to pull off, then I don't really see a real strong reason to play Conviction. It may turn out that +1/+3 is pretty strong. Sometimes it is. But for 2 mana, I'm a little bit off of it. So play this card if you really, really need to get Revolt and you have high payoff for Revolt. Otherwise, keep the card out of your deck. It's just not that big of a payoff for a whole card. Dawn Feather Eagle. Dawn Feather Eagle. Well, I attempted to click it there. Oh, there we go. Dawn Feather Eagle is 4 and a white for a 3/3 common bird creature with flying, and when Dawn Feather Eagle enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. Now, normally we've seen like 4 mana 3/3s that give this sort of effect without vigilance. They just come down and they pump your team for the turn, and those are pretty good in like these go wide white weenie decks, especially when you can curve out. If you can go 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, drop Dawn Feather Eagle, that is a super powerful play and a super powerful chain of cards. As is the card is good too. A 5 mana 3/3 flyer is okay. That's kind of like the base stats you want on a flyer. If you can't do better, 5 mana 3/3 flyer is like equivalent to, you know, like your 4 mana 3/3 ground creature or something like that. And the Anthem effect is pretty strong. The Vigilance is nice too, meaning that you're going to have blockers back and that your attackers are going to be pretty free to get in. Now, this goes very well in like a servo deck where you want to be going wide or something along those lines as like a mini inspired charge, and it's going to be able to attack in the air off further than that. I already mentioned there are a good number of 3 toughness and 3 power flyers in the format, so this blocks those 4/3s very well too, and it gets blocked by other 4/3s pretty nicely as well. So keep that in mind, that it's not just going to be like a dominant flyer or anything like that, but the ability justifies playing at least one of them, if not 2 of them, in your deck. Pretty strong card overall, in my opinion. I think it's pretty strong. I just got a Facebook notification, which I assume is Wizards banning the Cat Beast from Standard, but I'm excited to see if that happens or not. That would be hilarious. The next card here is Aerial Modification, and we're about to wrap up. I think we got 4 cards left. Aerial Modification is 5 mana, 4 and a white, for an uncommon aura with enchant creature or vehicle. Excuse me. As long as the enchanted permanent is a vehicle, it is a creature in addition to its other types, and the enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has flying. Now, we saw this with the red card, Siege Modification, I believe, which was 3 mana, gave +3/+0 in first strike, and had that same thing about making a vehicle a creature. This can slam in for tons of damage on the right vehicle. Flying is better than first strike, I think hands down, and +2/+2 is a nice little bonus. Not to mention that you could toss this on just a normal creature. It doesn't have to be a vehicle, but it starts doing some pretty busted things on vehicles. Like I said with the Red Siege, vehicles are already so pushed in power and toughness that if you can get around the whole crew cost, you just get to slam in for tons of damage, and this can come out of nowhere and destroy you. So be wary of cards like this in your opponent's sealed decks on pre-release. If you see that your opponent's just putting vehicles on the battlefield but not really doing anything with them, not crewing them, I would expect that they have one of these modification cards in their decks. But like if they're white, I would expect to see an aerial modification, and I would play around it. Maybe if they have like that stupid 7/10 or 7/11 or whatever, and they're just not doing anything with it, and they're playing white, I would expect that they're playing a modification. So you need to be prepared for that sort of situation, because turning it into a 9/13 flyer out of nowhere on turn 5 is going to win the game if you can't deal with that. So be able to deal with it is what I'm saying. Airdrop Aeronauts is 3 and double white for a 4/3 uncommon Dwarf Scout with flying and revolt. When Airdrop Aeronauts enters the battlefield, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, you gain 5 life. 5 life is a nice little bonus for Revolt, but this card is already solid enough on its own that I wouldn't go out of my way to make that 5 life matter unless I'm against an aggressive deck, or if I know that my opponent's going to be like just destroying me or something like that. If I'm really far behind, I may not be able to afford to wait on the Revolt trigger here, but if I can get the 5 life, I'll do what I can too. For instance, if I'm on turn 5 and I have this and maybe something else to play, and I know that the following turn I'm going to be able to get the Revolt going, I may just play off curve a little bit and play this on turn 6 or something like that. It is another 3 toughness flyer, but a 5 mana 4/3 flyer is pretty good on turn 5. Like I mentioned with the Eagle just a second ago, a 3/3 flyer for 5 is the baseline, so adding any toughness or power to that makes it a little bit better in my book. And I think the upside here of being like a flying Arbor Colossus is or Arborback Stomper, not Arbor Colossus, is pretty decent. Like that 5 life matters in the course of the game, especially in Kaladesh where, you know, you could take 10 damage by turn 4 and just be super far behind. So I like these guys. I think they're a pretty solid card. Again, just like I said with the 6 mana Improvise flyer, this is not like a bomb by any means, but it is a good card. And looks like we're down to the last 2. Alley Evasion. There's a lot of hiding behind alleys, so I guess evading the alleys is pretty nice. 1 white for a common instant. Choose 1. Target creature you control gets +1/+2 until end of turn. Return target creature you control to its owner's hand. So this is neat. Again, this is kind of you know, helps you with your Revolt cards, which is pretty sweet if you need it to. It works particularly nicely on Revolt cards where you can bounce a Revolt creature and then replay it if you need to. It's a little bit better than Conviction in that sense, since Conviction is not really a combat trick. +1/+2 is not super significant, but is usually enough for you to win a combat or at least make sure one of your creatures survives. And hopefully you don't have to use this on the +1/+2 mode unless you know that a creature your opponent controls is going to be dying in that exchange. But I think the flexibility on this card makes it at least main deckable. I like this better than Built to Last. Built to Last is not a card I particularly cared for that much, but I like the flexibility on this enough that I would probably main deck one of them in most of my white decks, and at least do so over Built to Last. The card is not like super powerful or pushed or anything, but it's efficient and flexible, and that's good for combat tricks. And then finally, Audacious Infiltrator is our last card to look at here. Last card from Aether Revolt is a 1 and a white 3/1 common Dwarf Rogue. Can't be blocked by artifact creatures. That's a decent bonus on a 3/1, but if you want a 3/1 in your deck, you'll play this card. If you don't, you won't play this card. 3/1s are the worst things to lose to little pingers, like the Fire Forger's Puzzle Knot or something like that. So if I see my opponent playing cards like this, I'm bringing in all my 1 toughness destroyers, and I'll be sad whenever, or they'll be sad whenever I kill them. But 3/1s have that added little bonus of being blocked by servos, which really sucks, but this guy can't be blocked by servos, so haha, I think that's the joke. But the added bonus that if you play this on turn 2 and your opponent doesn't have a play, you get to deal 3 damage, whereas most average games you'll be hitting for 2 damage or something like that. So Audacious Infiltrator, sweet little card. Not impressive, but a card that you'll play in your aggressive white decks, and a card that you'll actively look for, I think. 3/1s for 2, I think, are a little bit underrated. They're still going to trade for 2/2s, which is fine, which is what most 2-drops do anyway. So I think the downside of a 3/1 is that 1 toughness is a liability, whereas the upside is you get to deal a lot more damage over the course of a game if this thing goes unblocked or something like that. So against blue-based artifact decks, this card is going to be quite good, I think. Otherwise, it's just a filler material card. But with that being said, we've looked at everything in Aether Revolt. Before I start doing my reviews of the cards and giving them actual scores, I'd love to hear people's opinions. Maybe if I misread something or underevaluated or over-evaluated something, I'd love to hear from you guys. But until then, my name's Timothy, and I will see y'all next time.